All right, everybody, we still got people coming in online, but welcome back to the next segment of the American Studies Festival. And presenting our next speaker, we have former student, but current academic student advisor, Alexander Frederiksen. Come on up.
Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce to you the next guest speaker here, which is Dr. Gina Caison, who is an associate professor of Southern Literature at Georgia State University, where she teaches courses in American literature, indigenous literature, Southern literature, and documentary practices. From 2020 to 2022, she served as president of the Society for the Study of Southern Literature, and during the 2020 to 2021 academic year, she was a research fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study at Central European University in Budapest. Dr. Caison also worked on a podcast from 2016 to 2019 as a creator, co-producer, and host of the weekly podcast called About South, and was co-producer of the documentary film Uneasy Remains, which examines the history of the collection and study of indigenous human remains within the University of California system. Furthermore, Dr. Caison is also an award-winning author who has written numerous books, one of which has been published this fall. Actually, I think it was in November. Last Friday, okay, yeah. And the book is called Erosion, American Environments and the Anxiety of Disappearance, in which she traces how American authors and photographers have grappled with soil erosion as a material reality that shapes narratives of identity, belonging, and environment. So now, without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Professor or Dr. Gina Caison.
Okay. Hi, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I sometimes forget about the podcast and people approach me knowing all these things about what I think. And I'm like, how do you know that? And then I realize it's because I told everyone and published it.
Just use the arrows.
Just the arrows, yeah. So today, I do want to thank all of you for being here. Joran Brundle, Brian Ezel, so many people who made this possible. And I'm going to offer just one kind of framing remark about the book, is that this most recent book, which I'll share most of this work from today, is really a criticism of things I love. And I think that's important to remember. I do have harsh critiques of many places that I myself am very personally attached to. But for the contemporary exigency, I think a lot of times our most troubling ideologies lurk in the things that we love uncritically. And it's good to love things uncritically. We need enjoyment, and yet at the same time acknowledge how our investments in certain narratives might be allowing otherwise political ideals to persist that maybe would require some more examination from us. So today I talk about California, and I used to live in California. I love California very much. And so none of these remarks are meant as sharp as they may seem. I'm critiquing myself as much as anyone else. And I think today it's also interesting to see the connection between the first two wonderful talks, where Dr. Fisher-Fishkin was really talking about an author in Twain who maybe had intentions that audiences didn't realize. I'm talking about a photographer who maybe captured something that he did not intend. And so it's a little bit the inverse of when someone manages to capture an essence of something that is so clearly different from what their stated intentions were. And I think a lot of the last remarks really remind me, because so much of my work is in Indigenous studies and as a non-Native scholar, really thinking carefully about modes of democracy that are gamified, that are focused on ideas of winning and losing, versus like the wonderful remarks we just heard about deliberation, which is much closer to a lot of traditional indigenous methods of consensus building in political decision making that existed in the Americas before settler democracy. And I think that it's very encouraging to see a model that kind of encourages a return of imagination to those modes. So it's nice, I think, today to see the through line between these things. Also, you'll forgive me, reading glasses are a relatively new, fun addition to my life. And so I'm still getting used to the fact that when I look down, I can't see words. All right, so I'll begin. In the summer of 2019, the Los Angeles Times released a feature article on coastal erosion in California. And the title, as you see, emblazoned across an ever-shifting loop of ocean tide on the paper's website reads, "The California coast is disappearing under the rising sea. Our choices are grim." The article highlights a number of coastal locations across the state, from Gleason Beach, an hour north of San Francisco, to Imperial Beach, just above the US-Mexico border. There are also interactive maps showing what seawater inundation will mean for various cities, as the user can slide a dot along a scale to flood Fisherman's Wharf and send storm surge up to the edge of San Francisco's financial district, or completely level Imperial Beach to the south. The article also links the ocean game, where users have 8 turns to save an imaginary beachfront town from sea level rise. And the introductory page of the game notes, the sea is rising higher and faster. California could see a jump of more than 9 feet by the end of the century. Flooding and erosion threaten homes. Beaches could vanish. But everyone insists this is a game that can be won. So placing the user in the position of an elected official for a small beach town, you have 3 initial choices, which proceed on a choose-your-own-adventure model with a looping background of ocean sounds and animated cartoon citizens that resemble pegs from the board game Life, for those of you who are old enough to remember that game. Notably, each choice is marked by a number of dollar signs, and in addition to 8 turns, the user has 10 available dollar signs to save the town. The first choice, build a rock wall to protect the homes, costs $2 signs. Add sand to widen the beach, costs 3. And the cheapest option, which is somewhat insulting for people like us, hire a consultant for more information. The most conservative and bureaucratic choice, hires a consultant, results in this advice. Adding sand will make beachgoers happy, but beware, the sand washes away over time. Seawalls can protect homes, but they aren't good for beaches. If you can afford it, consider buying out beachfront homeowners to get them out of harm's way. The most expensive initial option, buying sand, yields good results for the first summer, but the game tells users that the sand ultimately washes away after a year, leaving them in the same predicament as before, except now the townspeople are anxious. As the game explains, your town is thriving and the economy is good, but people around town are fretting about the rising ocean. And now the middle of the road option, building a wall, gives the user this descriptive logic for their choice. I'm worried too. It's time to build a wall. Thus, at every turn of the game, the user is confronted by 2 intertwined variables, erosion and anxiety. So regardless of how one plays the ocean game, the only way to save the town is what the accompanying article refers to as, quote, managed retreat, which is a buzz phrase in the coastal erosion debate across the country. In the logic of the game, sand replenishment and rock wall construction both ultimately fail, and the game becomes less about geological processes, infrastructure, and innovation, and more about real estate negotiations with beachfront homeowners, all of whom have different buyout points and attachments to their homes, ranging from the emotional to the economic. As the water comes closer and closer, homeowners drop their selling prices. And depending on how aggressively one bids in the game, variables emerge that affect whether or not the managed retreat can occur before the ocean washes away public and private property. So the game then needs the anxiety of the ever-encroaching surf to make managed retreat, which is the only winnable path for the game, viable for the town's budget. And this anxiety is akin to the ticking clock temporality that Kyle Pauls White outlines as part of settler organized linear time. And White's point is that this ticking clock towards the climate apocalypse actually makes people bad decision makers, because of the sense of an end time that increases panic and perhaps polarization. So the game's central logic, that of winning and losing, is that the ocean always wins, but the user can also win if they can see that the ocean will be the ultimate winner. So in this simulation, the path to winning against erosion is finding a way to convince people to retreat through a combination of capital and imminent threat of disappearance, both of which seem to suggest some form of paradoxical acceptance. Accept that you cannot win against coastal erosion, or accept this amount of money to forget what you cannot accept. So the overall framework of winning and losing calls up ideas of lost causes, which for many are more associated with ideologies of the US South and neo-Confederate symbolism. However, the game's location in California perhaps allows it a more optimistic tone, assuring the user that battling erosion is, remember, a game that can be won. Either way, whether the user focuses on winning or losing, the game structure pits humans against the Earth, competing with the planet for their own survival, a dubious strategy that seems akin to the bad decisions that produced the problem in the first place. So taking this tension between erosion and anxiety at its cue, the first chapter of my book puts all of my cards on the table at once in what might strike some readers as an unlikely beginning point for what is ultimately a book about settler colonialism in the literature of the United States, California. So many people imagine the history of colonialism as a wave of progress or terror that washes from east to west, beginning somewhere around present-day New England and ending on the Pacific coast. And this is obviously a myth. Settler colonialism arrived in what we currently call Florida, invaded north with the Spanish from what we now know as Mexico, skirted east from Russia, then south from the present-day Alaskan coast, and appeared in multiple places and multiple times that leaves no narrative wave intact. In other words, California is as good of a place to start as any. And moreover, the ongoing process of settler colonialism is not history, and it doesn't count for all or even most of the history of the continent. Every place on the continent has a history that precedes, runs parallel to, entangles with, and will ultimately outlast the history of settler colonialism. California is not a frontier to be won or lost. And as multiple indigenous scholars from the region have shown, it's a place with a long history all its own, something that even progressively minded US citizens such as myself often seem to forget. So this talk then takes up a particular type of regional exceptionalism. And working in Southern studies, we talk about Southern exceptionalism quite a bit. But I'd like to talk about the popular representation of California that often renders it as the national space most associated with progressivism. However, when one focuses on erosion, the same declension narratives that inform representations of other regions also appear in narratives about the loss of California as an ever-disappearing prosperous future. In fact, the Los Angeles Times article on erosion sets up almost exactly this premise, where, quote, elsewhere, Miami has been drowning, Louisiana shrinking, North Carolina's beaches disappearing like a time lapse with no ending. While other regions grappled with destructive waves and rising seas, the West Coast for decades was spared by a rare confluence of favorable winds and cooler water. So all of these locations, notably in the US Southeast, despite the fact that rising tides will also affect New York and Massachusetts, are rendered as lost spaces of somewhere else, places where settler Californians could seemingly export their anxieties on distant declensions rather than core tenets of their own progressive fantasies. In order to elucidate the connections among anxieties of loss, landscape, and settler fantasies, I examined Louis Baltz's landscape photography for this talk today, and in the larger chapter, I pair this with Octavia Butler's novels of the speculative near future, alongside indigenous study sources about how indigenous ecological knowledges and land management operated in the region before and during early settler colonialism. So this examination demonstrates how even progressively minded discourses of land loss and environmentalism around climate change still often rely on the erasure of indigenous claims to homelands amid their own exceptionalisms. And so if you're not familiar with Louis Baltz, I'm going to show you the first image of this piece, the new industrial parks near Irvine, California. And this is really part of, this is really Baltz's first big show that gains a lot of recognition as part of what was called the New Topographics movement. It debuted in Rochester, New York. It is essentially the anti-landscape photography, but it is ironically still landscape photography, just of what is directly in front of the camera, and not this, as I talk about a little bit, this Ansel Adams California, but rather Baltz is just taking pictures of what is happening in Irvine at the time with these oxymoronically named the new industrial parks. And a lot of critics have talked about that naming. And I pair him with Butler, which I won't talk about Butler in these remarks, but I welcome questions if you're interested in Octavia Butler's work, because they're born 2 years apart. Baltz in Newport Beach. Butler is born in Pasadena. They're born in 45 and 47. They're contemporaries. They grow up in nearly the same place, work out of the nearly the same place for decades. And their work is kind of oddly resonant with one another, though there is no evidence that they were that familiar with each other's body of work in photography and literature. So, as I mentioned, Baltz offers a deep investment in the question of Western landscape as a product of materialist historical conditions, specifically the colonial obsession with, quote, exploration. In addition to being a prolific photographer, Baltz was also a prolific writer, composing various reflections on his own work, as well as critical commentary on other contemporaneous photographers' exhibits. And in these written reflections on his earlier 1970s landscape photography, Baltz begins to think through his own place in the genealogy of artists who photographed the American West. And these reflections carry through to his work in the late 1980s. So this body of prose work frames my analysis in this chapter of two of Baltz's most important California exhibitions, the New Industrial Park, seen here, and another one that we'll look at in a second called Candlestick Point in 1989. And they bookend his work in the genre of landscape photography. Now, one of the big criticisms of Baltz's work comes through in another exhibit I won't talk about at length, which is set in Utah in Park City. And it's an old mining site that he takes pictures of. And all of his pictures, they're relatively kind of ugly. And I say that with a lot of respect. The main criticism he gets is that he's simply just pointing the camera at the horizon and taking a picture. So to that criticism, Baltz himself notes, if this sounds as though I'm suggesting that I decided to simply level the camera and point it at the horizon, that is substantially correct. The formal qualities of these images echo an order implicit in the scene in front of the camera, an aesthetic similar to the NASA photographs of the surface of Mars. So in this way, Baltz's work can be understood as placed between two romanticized pillars of exploration: the Euro-American invasion of the West and the, quote, final frontier of colonized space, a theme that I also talk about in Butler's parable novels. Now, importantly, when Baltz is discussing Ansel Adams, he looks at how, to him, industrialism has made Adams' vision of photography no longer possible. But, indeed, this agrarian model may have been literally and figuratively eroded by industrialism. And this anxiety certainly subtends Adams' earlier landscape works on California, but this completely misses the point that the, quote, nature Adams records is not a pristine wilderness, but the traces of an ecology carefully cultivated and managed by California native peoples for thousands of years. So there's a lot of really good work, particularly in current wildfire debates of California. The reason there wasn't brush when early settlers are to California, and the reason the forests look the way they do, is the way the land management strategies of most indigenous groups in the region, who have is one of the longest continually inhabited places for indigenous peoples on the continent. These were carefully managed landscapes. And so people think they've entered Eden, and really they've just entered someone's heavily manicured backyard. So looking at that, and we look at this closer of Baltz series New Industrial Parks and Candlestick Point, one thing we kind of notice is there's not a lot of land in Baltz's landscape photography, and it reveals something about a particular late 20th century moment of erosion anxiety for California. So as Wolfgang Schepp points out, Baltz's singular oeuvre put an end to the image regime of the landscape. And despite this upending of a regime that often excised the apparitions of force that were part of this land acquisition, in quotes, Baltz's work is still inflected by his own kind of what I'm terming the horizon line. In other words, just as interesting as what Baltz sees in his own images is what he cannot see. While he unquestionably challenges the mythology of California from the Hollywood fantasies of Los Angeles to the techno-optimism of San Francisco, via his hyper-realist photographs, he also misidentifies the culprit for the waste he sees before him as an alienating industrialism rather than an invasive settler colonialism of which he himself is a continuous part. And in this way, his work is embedded within its own kind of what Nicholas Mirzoff calls, quote, white sight. So I lean really heavily on this idea of the horizon line. And indeed, no person can see beyond their own horizon line of understanding. It is by definition impossible. However, Baltz's photographs set up a compelling metaphor for the horizon of possibility, as settlers try to make sense of their own limitations of understanding the indigenous homelands of their own constructed American landscapes. Excuse me. Despite the limits of his horizon of understanding, though, Baltz remains one of the best recorders of what settler land abuse has done to the region. New Industrial Parks, which is a monographic series of 51 photographs, 8 of which were included in the new topographic show, depicts building facades and landscapes in the new office park, as it's named, outside of Irvine in Orange County. Not to come here and pick on where my host Brian is from. So the images contain numerous linear elements, and despite the fact that the architecture is new, the entire series together feels vaguely decrepit. The gray tones and flat surfaces evoke a sterility and alienation from what one might even imagine as landscape. And nothing truly monumental is contained in any of these photographs. As a result, the exhibition not only ushered in a renewed understanding of American landscape photography, but also queried a particular moment of imminent California Reaganism writ large for the country, where seemingly every place was no place interesting. So in this series with unnaturally flat and linear surfaces, it causes every living object in the frame to appear disturbingly uncanny in its refusal to get in line. So we'll go back to these poor, sad trees. And actually my copy editor, I said they were sad saplings, and she was like, they don't look sad to me. And I was like, stay in your lane, copy editor. But I take that critique. Maybe they look less sad to some people. But the most heated criticism of Baltz's work is his tendency to only engage, quote, the surface. So I think that part of my larger argument is this surface is feature, not flaw. The critique misses the mark in that Baltz does anything but naturalize the industrial park contradiction. And I want to kind of extend this to say that, of course, Baltz's work stays on the surface and fails to tell us anything new about the sprawling suburban landscape. This surface of nothing strikes me as the very point Baltz's images make. The settler colonial late capitalist industrial park has no depth. Like haphazardly thrown sod, and you'll notice they're no longer sad, misplaced saplings surrounded by concrete, it has no effective roots. So even though Baltz may have been unable to link his own image making to the settler colonial history of California, it doesn't mean that his images don't record it. He levels his camera at a horizon entirely predicted on a shallow history of place, and the resulting images offer just that. If the elegance of these images is, have some described them, mortuorial, which is interesting because his father was a mortician, then it's likely because such land uses practices that do in fact represent death. Instead of offering a romantic wilderness California like early generations of landscape photography, a genre that certainly covered over the death and exploitation of both indigenous peoples and homelands in the region, Baltz offers an assessment of the land that makes the destruction plain. His photographs stay on the surface because that is where settler colonialism lives and where erosion occurs. So Baltz himself acknowledges in his words, the United States is a surface nation in a 1975 review essay on photographer Robert Adams' work in the New West. He writes, posing an ecological threat that is only now being taken into account, the sprawl city is as hostile to genuine urbanism as it is to the land it recklessly consumes. For as much as the landscape is deformed by the encroaching suburban juggernaut, traditional urban, and he puts in parentheses, i.e. civilized values are equally under attack. American civil culture, never so very deep, disappears if spread too thin. And again, Baltz hits a mark that it's not clear he was aiming for. From an Indigenous studies perspective, American civil culture is shallow, especially compared with Indigenous civil cultures and roots. His emphasis on civilized urban values gestures towards a particular kind of mainstream American life as a height of correct thinking that is under attack by suburban middle-class sprawl. The anxiety here, as Baltz makes plain, is not really about land damage at all. Rather, it's about a disappearance of something that is always on the verge of not existing because of some of its foundational inherent unsustainability, and that is the United States of America. The anxiety of erosion that the Los Angeles Times explores in 2019 is only a continuation of what Baltz attempts to diagnose in the 1970s. Neither project, however, seems able to take a step back and realize that the core issue perhaps underlying all of this is an American project built on stolen Indigenous homelands. So in the second major exhibit I look at, Candlestick Point in 1989, this is the last major landscape work that Baltz works on. And you can notice from this image, almost as you can see in the, as you can see in the macro, this is absolutely a horizon line set. Some people charge that Baltz didn't even get out of the car to take these pictures, and I don't know if that's true or not, but I think if he did, he would say, yeah, that is the point of Southern California. Like, you don't get out of the car. Like, this is what it looks like. So Candlestick Point, for those of you that don't know, is a space just outside of San Francisco. He takes the pictures before it's been cleared for the building of the Giants 49ers Candlestick Park, which is now been torn down. Things move very fast. And I'll talk a little bit, it's been the society, for those of you who live in San Francisco, know it's been the site of numerous bureaucratic delays to redevelop it. And the pictures of today, I double checked this morning, ironically look almost exactly like before the park was built that Baltz takes us in 1989. So we'll look at the first image just to give you a sense. This is how virtually every image looks. The site is also similar to San Quentin Point that Baltz also photographs during this time. It's a lot of construction waste. It's a lot of landfill dug up from the bay from other construction projects, which is a weird inverse of erosion that actually geologically creates more erosion. Where it's deeper, you have sustained wave activity. So the problems and the solutions are always flipping over on one another. And then this is a very important image that you'll only understand when you see the next one. And Baltz almost always, his entire career, had worked in black and white. All of these are in black and white. But notably, something curious happens toward the end of Candlestick Point with no announcement. Baltz suddenly switches into color. His final interviewer, Jeff Ryan, calls it his, quote, Wizard of Oz moment, to which Baltz explains, I was winding down from something. This was the piece of which I took everything I knew and used it and didn't want to repeat it again, ever. When Ryan notes the unusual and uncomfortable scrub landscape of Candlestick Point, Baltz again loops back to his work in Orange County earlier, claiming, quote, when I think about the landscape in Orange County and when and where I grew up and looking at it today, they took paradise and created New Jersey in a generation. William Burroughs said that America was always evil, waiting there, lurking, even when the first settlers walked across the Bering Strait. And where we have the point where Baltz cannot see past his own constructed horizon line. Those weren't settlers that walked across the Bering Strait, which is also incidentally a now largely disproven theory to explain the entire peopling of the American continent versus only a portion. And while the nation state or idea we call America might be evil, as some would argue, the idea of it lurking behind indigenous presence creates this tone of inevitability that makes evilness in America and settler colonialism a foregone conclusion, when I don't know that those coterminous things necessarily are. So the inevitable of so-called evil of America didn't happen as unimpeded destiny. It's a series of choices to believe in the myths of an empty wilderness or a settler agrarianism, or to believe that land destruction happened first in a place along the East Coast, like New Jersey, and it only lately arrived in California. And none of that story is inevitable or true. It's only true if we pick certain pieces. It's only true up to a certain point of horizon line. So in this Wizard of Oz moment, I argue that what viewers experience more than the switch into color is perhaps the futility of wizards behind curtains, who will not ever be able to help recover a, quote, no place like home for settler colonialism in the Americas. In other words, in Baltz's landscape work, viewers see both how the invention of a California exceptionalism and the rejection of it still struggle to come to terms with settler colonialism and the recognition of indigenous homelands. But then what of actual material erosion? Projections suggest that all of this reclaimed land of Candlestick Point is going to be underwater with a worst-case sea level rise of 66 inches by the year 2100. At the same time, San Francisco is currently trying to turn the multi-million-dollar mixed-use development community, echoing the real estate development of San Quentin Point 30 years prior. So considering this, does California exceptionalism look like managed retreat or some fantasy of realistic real estate? According to a 2016 pro-development article by John King of the San Francisco Chronicle regarding the Candlestick Point real estate venture, quote, after the dirt is graded and compressed, the shop scheduled to open on the site in 2019, that was 5 years ago, it basically looks like this, except after the interstitial football stadium. It will be located as much as 10 feet above the former level of the entrance to the stadium used by the Giants and 49ers, a height intended as a safe perch above the rising sea for another century or more. While the author covers some of the potential challenges that might face such a water's edge development, he notes, quote, the fact is this land exists. It would be overly cautious to rule these tracts off limits because of environmental pressures that might not be felt in our lifetime. San Franciscans could benefit in decades to come if carefully planned projects to create space for housing and jobs, as well as parks that bring people to the water. So the troubling logic of this argument implies that problems that extend past one's own lifetime are not problems to be considered at all. For King, the very existence of the land now means that it must be developed in real estate terms, without a totally clear picture of what will happen for following generations. In other words, it's a solution that refuses the responsibility of what I mentioned earlier, of kinship time for all of our kin in the future. The fact that Baltz managed to photograph Candlestick Point 40 years before it became a new booster plan mixed-use development site, like his previous work in Irvine, and not after, is equal parts accidental and prescient. It illustrates on some level a tacit awareness that while as a citizen of the 1980s, Baltz may have had the anxiety of a sudden nuclear holocaust at the forefront of his mind, which I note that he writes about. There was perhaps in his work an awareness of another slower moving apocalypse continually reimagined and rendered by real estate developers as progress. So the Chronicle's King, and I'll show you a picture, this is the vision, this is a drawing, this is not reality, of Candlestick Point. So King praises San Francisco for being better, more cautious than other places in the United States, noting that the development project incorporates a variety of measures to cope with climate change that's expected to alter the bay. And quote, they also show that the science of sea level rise still heresy in some parts of the nation, is taken seriously by local decision makers. This idea that somewhere out there in other parts of the nation, people regard rising waters as heresy does nothing if not continue the mythology that somehow California is different, better, more progressive than other communities facing the reality of sea level rise. Even while the article notes that Orrin Pilkey, a leading expert on coastline adaptation and shore erosion, offers his positive impression of the plan, one still has to wonder how smart it is to build what the developer describes as, quote, apartments, condos, townhomes, and high-density towers that constitute, quote, thousands of planned mixed-income dwellings in a location that is certainly going to face at least several feet of rising water. Currently, the proposed development is wading through a sea of bureaucratic delays, but in the meantime, the developers' projections for the area all promise a rosy future where people live and work in a tactical urbanist dreamscape, as you see before you. But the problem remains. It's unlikely the sea is going to rise for the next 8 years and then simply stop in place. Other cities, such as Galveston, Texas, a place one can imagine King thinks is part of the nation where climate change is, quote, heresy, tried over 100 years ago to simply elevate the town by several feet and hope the ocean would never catch up. And that's true. Galveston did that. It's an amazing project to read about. But on a warming planet, the ocean always catches up. If San Francisco, California, as Rebecca Solnit said, an infinite city that is, quote, the un-American place where America invents itself, end quote, then what does building thousands of people's homes on Candlestick Point say about this next reinvention of America? Thank you.
Blink. You can do it. Just 1 second. Think of a question while you wait, okay? And show of hands, who wants to ask a question?
While you wait, I do have a few copies of the book for sale. Brian has them and is my Danish intermediary. And the royalties go to the Food Sovereignty Lab in Humboldt, which is an indigenous project, Land Memory Bank, another indigenous project in southern Louisiana, and the Waccamaw Siouan Tribal Healing Garden in eastern North Carolina.
All right, excellent. Thank you for that. So we got the mics up and running. Questions in the room? Please raise your hand. I have one over here.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the talk. And yeah, just as a correction, I'm not from Irvine. I'm actually from Chino, California, which is, if you've seen the OC, is where the bad kid comes from. Go to the OCs. Important correction. But yes, a more serious comment. Yeah, I think maybe I'm paraphrasing you, but you talked about this idea of an anxiety or erosion is kind of inherent to like America. And there's a sort of evidence of this in different media and literature. And I'm just curious how, yeah, if you can elaborate on what that means or how far we can take this, because, and I hate to relate everything to Trump and current events, but I mean, it is interesting how this very openly expressed sense of, America being a terrible place to live, right? And it's kind of central to otherwise very patriotic. People self-describe patriots all say America is terrible in many places. And it just seems so bizarre. And I'm curious how much of this relates to this idea of erosion, i.e. the superficiality on which American values really stand, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think a lot of it, something that I started to notice, and I wrote most of this book as the wonderful introduction noted, while I was living in Hungary during the 2020 election. And, I've done many cursory searches for erosion, and you're just as likely to get results about the erosion of democracy as you are about the erosion of land. And I find that conflation so interesting because these aren't quite similar things. I think when we hear the erosion of democracy, not that that's incorrect, but there's just a conflation of feelings. And for me, a lot of that is, when is this anxiety over environmentalism in the land and anxiety about the actual care of the earth? And when is it an anxiety about just my comfort on that piece of land? And those are two very different things. My comfort as an American citizen in certain places that I have access to certain things, if my environmentalism is only seeking to preserve that for myself, then that seems like a really shallow commitment. And when that gets conflated to the erosion of democracy that isn't, and this is something I appreciated about the last talk, as if there's no room for imagination, if there's no room for cooperation, if there's no room for other adjustments to government coming out of something like indigenous models of collaboration and deliberation and consensus, if we're just foregone conclusion that doesn't exist, and we're saying the erosion of democracy is just simply an erosion of a game where we can get an uncontested winner, then I'm not really sure that the preservation of what of a lot of us think right now of just a game of where 51 people are happy and 49 people are upset actually gets us to better outcomes. And so much of that, I think, is exacerbated by this anxiety, this ticking anxiety of climate change that makes us not very good at taking the time to talk to one another. So I think that's kind of the scope of how it developed for me. And at the same time, you know, I think if you're living on lands like the Houma in southeastern Louisiana, which are disappearing at the average rate of a football field, well, an American football field, and an hour, which is slightly smaller than your football field, but not by much. This idea of the long game of democracy is not doing a lot for you in that. Like, the actual land is going. If you're talking about indigenous land back movements, well, how does that gonna work with the Houma? The land's gone. So that's where I start to see these issues coming together. I hope that answers your question.
Next question.
Thank you so much for this talk. I've thought a lot about and taught a lot about this topic of erosion and of land disappearing and how it has different stakes for different communities in the US and beyond. And I guess one of the things that I always find so fascinating about doing that is that it seems to me that when these communities are experiencing land loss, a lot of them, at least if they're more affluent white communities, almost act like, why is this happening to us? And what localized solution? Let's build a wall. Let's do something local. And there's like this lack of being able to understand, oh, the cause of this is actually like global warming on a massive scale. Like you're saying, the ocean will always win. It's just like this, even my students, you know, they're not really understanding that it's the CO2 emissions that get into the water that cause the sea. Well, there's just like kind of this massive like lack of ecological understanding. So I guess with this particular problem, do you think that art can help to address that problem of like people not having a fundamental ecological literacy, I guess, number one, but also of this treatment of what is a global problem that of course some people are more heavily contributing to than others, but help people recognize that and place their own like community circumstance within this larger thing so that they might realize like building the wall it's what, like, you can't wall out the ocean, right? Like, I don't know if you think.
Have you read The Wall, that novel, The Wall? Oh,
that's great.
Yeah,
I didn't know about it.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay, I will be.
Thank you so much for that. I think that one of the things that's very interesting to me about erosion is the hyper locality of it. So something that you hear a lot in Southern studies when we're critiquing exceptionalisms, no place is exceptional, right? And that's very true when we look at something like climate, but every place is particular. And so In California, a particular issue is obviously landslides, which, like damming of the rivers and then real estate development and landslides. And one of the legal doctrines that has had some success in the courts in California and hasn't elsewhere is sand rights. So if the beach is public property and the public invest in the beach, if you have built a massive estate that is holding back the land, landslides happen because it is a beach, geologically speaking, it is a beach's last resort to get land. The earth, as a geologist said to me, the earth is trying to get smooth. We're just trying to hold on while it does. And I think about that all the time as a literature scholar. I'm like, it's trying to get smooth. But he didn't mean it that deep, probably. But there's a truth to that. So in California, you have this idea of sand rights, that the beach has a right to its sand. And if you are preventing the beach from getting its sand, you're actually stealing from the public. And I think that that's an interesting idea on the local level to get people to think about if the beach is this place that we're all maybe have some sort of fantasy about investment to and access to, when you have massive development that is stealing the beach, rather than it's the one house that falls down and the focus on that individual's loss of real estate, what is the entire public losing when we're not looking at a large scale kind of development plan that looks at that? And there's a lot of good work in California right now. There's a lot of undamming of rivers that had caused massive damage. They had said it was going to take roughly 80 years for the ecosystem to recover. And some of those ecosystems are already something like 70% recovered. So it's kind of amazing what can happen. So I think the local level is such a good place to look at it. And the other thing is, I think erosion makes us realize that we can't imagine the planet, but we can imagine this gully that has ruined this much land in Georgia. Or I grew up kind of near the beach in North Carolina, and the Outer Banks, one end of the Outer Banks has to erode and the sand gets deposited at the other. Something as simple as education about how erosion's not always negative, it's just a process. We don't have, as Arne Pilke has said elsewhere, we don't have an erosion problem, we have a bad real estate problem. And those are two very different problems. And a real estate problem actually can kind of be solved with policy if you get the right people in the room. Erosion isn't necessarily a problem, it's a process. So I do a lot of work trying to think at in between those two.
Anyone else? Have Sebastian,
Thank you for your talk. So I was not familiar with the Ocean Game, and it seems I wanted to ask you a question of whether there's a place for games to help people imagine the connection between the what you referred to as sort of kinship time, I mean sort of like 7 generations, to get people to think about time in a different way, and also about the connection between basically global problems and the challenge of climate change and the impact on local issues like erosion. My kids used to play SimCity and Civilization, and I believe that there are people now who are working on, given the sort of short attention span of kids, to gamify certain kinds of educational challenges. And are the kinds of challenges you were talking about ones that are suited to maybe being addressed, at least for younger children, on a game level, but with different trade-offs? In other words, the problem with the Ocean Game wasn't that it was a game, but it was that the way to win was so narrowly conceived. So do you envision this as a possibility that could be utilized for good ends?
Absolutely. I think that is the core. And I didn't plant your question, but I have a bonus slide that shows you the end of the Ocean Game, which is oddly congratulatory given the image of houses falling in the ocean, where it says, "Well done." Exclamation point, well done. All 4 owners agreed to move out of harm's way. You now have more space on the beach. And if this isn't a mixed message, I don't know what it is, because you have more space on the beach, but it's like, because the houses are falling in it, like I can't quite ever get, and I've played this game so many times, obviously during writing this book. I think you're right. It's not just the fact of the game. It's how the whole idea of winners and losers and fighting the earth and what we're fighting for is misconstrued. So the American Studies program, I'm blanking on her name. She's recently retired and she works on game development around climate change at UNC Chapel Hill. And the way that she has worked with lots of different stakeholders to have, and she has students build games to think about what are the better ways to get to outcomes and possibility that can enliven some imagination. Oh, I remember something about your question about art. I'm gonna come back to that. I think there is something there. It's about talking to Indigenous scholars, Indigenous communities. It's something that I think the Indigenous Studies program at Cal Poly Humboldt is doing a really good job with. Bringing multiple people to the table to say, this is how we think of the land management in this region. We need to put this on the table as an option rather than like an increasingly privatized grab of anxiety of everyone holding on to their individual property with tight hands. If we can create games and works of art that enliven some sort of imagination for alternatives, if you do that with the right stakeholders, I think it can be done. And I will say that Rosanna Zia, who wrote this article, did eventually publish a book of this work, and it's clear working with News from Native California and other people that I think her work got to a much better place than some of these initial articles, but it's because she started talking to more people who don't just think of the land as real estate and property. When it stays at that level, the winning and losing comes forward versus what's a game where we all win? And it's maybe one where the planet is healthy for us to be alive and have access to things. What can art do? I think one of the reasons I like to study literature, it is, I'm sure whales tell each other stories and we don't know about it, but it's the one thing we know as a species that we kind of do that's different. And also we all do it. Like you can't put more than two people together in the history of the planet, it seems, before they start telling each other stories. And so to me, everything about what we might be able to do to survive really may come down to what we understand about how narrative, how art does enliven this possibility, whether that's through a traditional novel or text or photograph, or even what the humanities have to offer to something like game design in terms of imagining possibility.
Thank you so much. I think we're running out of time now, and we need to start up our next event as well. Thank you, Dr. Caison. Please give her a round of applause. To the people on Zoom, we're going to end this Zoom room. Please join us for our last Zoom room of the day, where we will have student presentations and also the student awards. Thank you.
Thanks so much.